Do you not feel bad for doing this to your family?
I don't know.
I killed my family and then set the house on fire.
Your dad and your stepmom were found dead.
I beat him to death with a baseball bat.
Are you a family annihilator?
You mean like, did I shoot my wife and my son?
Yes.
No.
What happened?
Well, I guess the correct term would be, I snapped. I took my little K-bar there and planted it straight into my mother's back.
When we think about family, we think about people who love us and care for us and support us, and someone who's going to be there to protect us and keep us safe. On the contrary, family annihilators and individuals who have psychopathy, their motives are the opposite. They're manipulative and cunning, and while they might appear loving, they are not, and often they're scheming and planning to destroy their entire family, usually out of rage or vengeance.
We don't think about the person who sits across the dinner table from us, the person who sleeps down the hall from us, the person who watches our children when we can't be there is the most dangerous person in our life. We're going to cover a unique and particularly chilling group of murderers, individuals who are not only psychopathic, but what we think of as family annihilators. The people they turn on are their people that are closest to them.
In South Carolina, a major fall from grace for a member of a prominent legal family.
Guilty.
Alec Murdaugh found guilty on all counts for the murders of his wife Maggie and son Paul on the family's sprawling hunting estate back in 2021.
Alex Murdaugh, from the outside, had all the trappings of an incredibly successful, wealthy, well-connected member of his community. Prominent law firm, happy family, beautiful real estate. It all looked pretty perfect. And it was this image that he worked very hard to maintain and a fantasy which eventually started to crack.
Murdaugh is already facing a slew of charges involving millions of dollars in alleged theft, fraud, and money laundering, some stemming from the death of Murdaugh's former housekeeper.
Psychopaths, especially if they're at the head of the family, will use their family to bolster their self-esteem, their image. So the importance of having a beautiful wife, a nice car, successful children becomes fused with their desire to appear successful. And it becomes more important to protect that image than to really care about the family members. He had worked so hard to create this image, it became necessary for him to do anything he could to preserve that, including the murder of his family for financial gain, and to shift the attention away from all of the other misdeeds that he had committed.
And there's a chronic failure to take responsibility or of lack of willingness to take responsibility. There's also a lack of remorse or guilt. He just doesn't feel bad. There's no real emotions, despite the fact that his wife and his younger son have been brutally attacked and killed.
Alec, is there anything you want to share?
After a dramatic day in court, Murdaugh led out into a van in handcuffs to continue his life behind bars.
Alex Murdaugh chose fantasy over family and stopped at nothing to preserve that image, that fantasy life he had built. Gran Amato did the same thing. And both of these men showed a willingness to take that need to the ultimate extreme.
Breaking news, a murder mystery emerges in the woods. 3 people are dead. In a house in Chuliota, police discovered a family murdered. A couple in their 50s and their son in his 30s were found dead. And now, this just in, the prime suspect is a family member, Grant Amato.
Over the past 4 months or something like that, I've been talking to this woman online.
Who's she?
She's, as embarrassing as it is, she's a cam model.
A what?
A cam model. A cam model is like a virtual girlfriend, I guess you could say.
How are you? I've been having a long day.
I understand. You were sweet to me yesterday. So I'll be understanding today.
He's an adult male living with his parents. And not only is he living off of them, but he's actually using their money for this cam girlfriend. But online to this cam model, he is this online gamer. He creates this impression that he's a much more independent, successful individual than he is in reality.
So how much do you think you spent on this?
Probably close to like $200,000, I'd say.
$200,000?
Yeah. Countless times my dad would like come up to me and he'd make like me feel guilty so that I would, do everything that I can, like in a job.
Almost like a motivation?
Right. He would just make me feel bad, like I'm not contributing.
His father gives him an ultimatum, which includes a list of rules that he's going to have to follow if he's going to stay in the house.
One of the stipulations was, if you speak to this woman again, you're out of the house.
All right, Sylvia, look at me. I'm outside going to check the mail.
Amato is on the brink of being discovered. His family's going to reach out to this cam model, and he knows he's going to be exposed. So this entire fantasy world, this persona that he's created, and that this cam girlfriend believes is him, is about to be completely blown up in his face.
Do you not feel bad for doing this to your family?
I don't know.
What's amazing here is completely the lack of any emotional response, the lack of any sense of guilt or remorse. He killed one member of the family after the other over the course of nearly 4 hours. That's a dedication. That's cold-blooded.
Nobody likes to be picked last or to feel left out. But to a psychopath, sometimes even the most minor slight or element of rejection can feel like an enormous transgression, like we see in the case of Paris Bennett was doing. And he did it in a very calculating manner. So on the night that this happened,
age, and any child under the age of 6 that is murdered carries the weight of capital murder.
While we classically think of a family annihilator as somebody who kills at least 2 members of their family, the Paris Bennett case is unique. But ultimately, he is still a family annihilator. Paris Bennett told authorities his true hatred was towards his mother. And while he had fantasies and thoughts about killing her, he realized that if he could take her child away, that would be far more painful to his mother than anything he could actually do to her. He managed to destroy his entire family with that one action on that one day.
Bennett responded to his perception of rejection from his mother in a very cold, callous way by murdering his 4-year-old sister. We see a similar pattern in Russell Overland where he has lived off of his father and stepmother for many years. And whenever they confront him about that, he's angry about it. What we see here is a rejection or perceived rejection, and he responds in a very cold, callous way.
I did dump Naomi in the well. She was still alive. And to me, that gave me great pleasure. She went at first. Yeah, head first. In fact, I had a little trouble getting her arms, because her arms kind of butterfly pattern. So I had to kind of play with her a little bit to get her right arm to go down. But plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is. I suppose I should be more remorseful. I can't seem to find a job that I like. I'm basically alone in the world, except for the folks.
In 2007, Russell Overland, a middle-aged man, lives most of his adult life off his elderly father and stepmother. He lives this parasitic life of continuing to rack up financial debt and expects his father to bail him out. And when his elderly parents expect him to straighten up and fly right and be an adult, Russell Overland reacts with a level of rage and callousness and decides to kill them.
I hate my stepmom.
You do?
I honestly say that I can really, truly say that I hate her. I have been thinking about doing her in for probably 4 years or better. I was not welcome in the house. She thought that I smelled. She had a note on the door that said remove shoes. But she basically made it clear to me that she thought that I was raised like a heathen. I have a plastic tub and I use that to pee in. But she basically said that your room smells like a rest area or an outhouse.
Russell Overland says, I've been thinking about killing his stepmom for a very long time. And then he tells us why his room smells and it needs to be cleaned up. It smells like an outhouse. That's her crime. That's her sin. And it offends him. She merits being killed because she doesn't accept the way he wants to live. But he's living in her house on her property. And this is the selfish point of view from the psychopath. They don't acknowledge that other people have rights about what they feel.
Why don't you tell us the details of how it happened?
I beat him to death with a baseball bat. I hit her with it, probably 2 or 3 times. Then when Father said, well, you better go somewhere or get out of here or whatever, I said, I'm going to call 911. When he started to go through the door into the kitchen, I hit him from behind and took care of him.
How many times you hit him?
Probably half a dozen, and I finished him off with a pillow. Smothered him.
What's disturbing about Overland describing this murder is that he's talking about it as if he's talking about going to the store and buying a new jacket. I mean, there's really no emotion behind what he's talking about. There's certainly no indication of remorse or that he feels bad about any of this.
What'd you do after that, Russ?
I used a loader. Did Naomi first. Put her in the well.
Did you have them both in the loader or just her?
One at a time. Ladies first.
A psychopath will view the family members as useful to them in the moment to get what they want. They don't have any concern for your feelings if you happen to disagree with them. You are simply an obstacle and an impediment. They figure out how to get rid of you, get you out of the way, so that they can accomplish their goal.
While Paris Bennett's case and Russell Overland's case maybe look very different on some levels, what we see in both of these family annihilators is the same motivation, which was to eliminate the people that rejected them. But it is also important to remember that it was their perception, it was how they saw the world, because they weren't able to do things exactly the way they wanted.
Three-year-old Michael Smith and his 14-month-old brother, Alexander, reportedly kidnapped Tuesday night. The boy's mother, Susan Smith, told police a lone gunman forced her to get out of her car without her children.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home.
After a massive 72-hour search, police are baffled.
Except for the mother, there were no witnesses.
We are going to look at everything and rule out nothing until we can do it with evidence.
Susan Smith ultimately killed her children for her own desires. She wanted to date an individual who said he didn't want children. So in order to be able to date him, she just took her children out of the equation. These types of behaviors match what we see in psychopathy whenever we see individuals that are manipulative, deceitful, callous, cold, failure to accept responsibility for their actions, and ultimately pursue their own agenda, no matter what it costs to anybody else in their lives.
Killing her two children, I mean, that's something. You carry them children for 9 months and then all of a sudden you kill them. This just ain't right.
When psychopathic individuals engage in conventional life, they get into relationships, they maybe go on to get married, they go on to have children. But for psychopathic individuals, their narcissism, their focus on themselves and meeting their own needs really remains intact even when they become parents.
Like Susan Smith, John Hummel is another family annihilator who wanted to be a free agent. This is an individual who perceives his family as a prison that he has to escape.
Is everybody out of the house?
I know if they got out or it just 4 includes myself. My wife is pregnant too.
John Hummel saying, well, I'm not sure if they got out. My family of 4, it was 4 of us that were in there. Oh, and by the way, my wife is pregnant also. He seems eerily calm. It's not the reaction you would expect if someone were watching their house burn down with their family in it.
John Hummel doesn't seem to be concerned. There's no panic in his voice. He's matter of fact. And he just says, there are 4 people who live in this home, including me.
What happened? I was stupid. What do you mean you're stupid? I killed my family and then set the house on fire.
Police say 3 bodies, including one of a small child, were found inside this flame-engulfed home early this morning. Family members identify the victims as 34-year-old Joy Hummel and her 6-year-old daughter, Jody. Hummel's father, Eddie Bedford, is also among the deceased.
She just found out she was pregnant with her second baby, and she was so excited.
Was basically started when I met this girl. Kept wishing more and more that I was single. I know it was wrong. I was gonna slit their throats while they slept. But the knife was too dull, and when I went for my wife, she woke up and started fighting back.
We know that psychopathic individuals have a higher threshold for excitement. They experience boredom more intensely and sooner than most of us. That conventional life oftentimes ends up feeling boring to them. That everyday routine and monotony oftentimes challenges a psychopathic individual. But it's hard for many of us to understand how somebody who could be driven to killing members of their family, particularly their own children, when it's about a need to be in a new relationship. Why not just file for divorce? Those are still options that are far better than annihilating your family members by killing them.
I stabbed her in the neck. She was screaming, and I ended up grabbing a baseball bat and hitting her with it. And I took the baseball bat into my father-in-law's room, hit him over the head a couple of times. I know it was wrong, but wasn't thinking right, I guess. What about your daughter? Same thing.
There's nothing about the way he's saying this that would make you think that he was describing murdering his family. There's just really no expression. There's no emotional drive behind it. He's just very calmly stating it. Violent psychopaths hold no value for human life. Hummel writes, I feel a strong bond with you that I've never had with anyone else. And the girlfriend asked, well, not even with your wife? Nope. Then why did you marry her? And Hummel said, I truly cannot think of a reason except for my kid. It's really striking because in these text conversations with the girlfriend, Hummel is painting himself in some ways as a victim, almost like he just married her because she was pregnant. You know, he's stuck and he's trapped almost by this pregnancy and this wife that he doesn't really want.
The family's getting in the way. And so rather than asking for a divorce, leaving, or just having an affair, which is in the normal range of possibilities, he kills them and burns them in their beds and sets the house on fire and has no remorse about it at all. And if you're shocked by that, that's a good sign because it means you're normal.
They want what they want when they want it, and they will take out anything that presents an obstacle. Another reason that family annihilators act on those urges and impulses is simply to maintain control. We see this sometimes in child custody cases. When a parent fears that they're going to lose custody of their children, they take out their entire family. They take out their children, and then they turn to themselves.
Today, a special accident investigation team is using drones to figure out how the Hart's SUV plunged off this 100-foot ocean overlook. The county sheriff says the parents' bodies were found in the front seats. 3 of the children's bodies were found along the shoreline.
From the outside, the Hart family seemed magical. These mothers have adopted these children, rescued them from otherwise bad situations, and are providing them memories of a lifetime.
In the case of Jennifer Hart and Sarah Hart, this is a family that seemed picture perfect on the surface. All social media accounts and public accounts of this family are that these were two women who loved their 6 adopted children. But what we also know from the investigation is that there were no brake marks. There were no skid marks, which means Jennifer stopped, paused, and made the decision to drive the entire family of 8 over a cliff to their death. The public image of the family and all the social media accounts of the Harts was that they were a loving, close family. But what we also know is that the truth of what was going on for the Hart family was far more dark.
In 2011, Sarah Hart pleaded guilty in Minnesota to domestic assault. According to court records, a teacher saw bruises on the couple's 6-year-old daughter.
It gets uncovered that this family had actually been being investigated by Child Protective Services. And every time these services would catch up with them and try to investigate allegations of abuse.
This is the result.
Ultimately, Jennifer Hart was a parent who felt she was losing control of the situation and was at risk of losing her children. She made the ultimate decision that if she could not have them, no one would.
We see in individuals with psychopathy is they become very myopically focused on their goal, whatever their goal is, and in this case, retaining control. Like Jennifer Hart, another mother that was unwilling to relinquish control of her children was Elaine Campione.
Now you understand that you've been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder?
Yes, I
Okay.
understand.
At any point, did you push her under the water?
No,
How did they die?
I'm not allowed to speak without an attorney present.
Miss Campione appears sort of lost and confused, as though she doesn't really understand how her 2 daughters ended up dead. She looks a little upset, but certainly not in any way in a manner that would be consistent with that genuine loss. I think she's trying to think on her feet in terms of, how do I handle this? She had a very deliberate plan in terms of how this was all gonna happen, and it didn't work. She woke up and...
Same from you.
In both the Hart case and the Campione case, the children are objectified and used for the emotional well-being of the murderers. In the Hart case, the children are used to bolster the image of this perfect family, and when that image gets destroyed, then the kids get destroyed as well. In the Campione case, the children...
When we look to family annihilators, we understand that while most of us have an expectation and presumption of safety and trust within our family units, for the family that has a psychopath in their family circle, that's simply not necessarily true.
Good afternoon. A 19-year-old man has admitted killing his parents and then using their credit cards to spend £30,000 on trips to the US and Caribbean. Brian Blackwell was suffering from a serious personality disorder when he beat and stabbed his parents to death at their home on Merseyside.
When Brian Blackwell was arrested, it was a shock for staff and students here at Liverpool College. They'd seen him just days earlier when he came in here alone to pick up his A-level results.
When Brian came in, obviously his results were very good. He seemed very happy. He was part of a group of youngsters who were very pleased with what the results they had and seemed perfectly normal.
Brian Blackwell was an individual who, growing up, was labeled as very bright. He was nicknamed the Brains. His parents were really proud of him and excited for his future. They thought he could be a great surgeon. And unbeknownst to them, this outcome for him could not be further from that projection.
He's told, you can't go on a trip with your girlfriend. Then the solution to this problem is to kill the parents so that he can go on a trip with his girlfriend. Most people who are normal would say there's another solution. But with the psychopath, they want what they want when they want it. It's usually lower impulse control. And so the action in Blackwell's case of killing the parents is the immediate solution to the problem. It surprises people then when they hear that someone who is apparently normal has murdered their parents. We still have this long-standing belief that if you're going to commit a murder, there's a long track record of you creating havoc all along the way. And although that's true sometimes, it's not necessarily the norm with people with psychopathy.
Andrew Balser, this is another example of a good kid gone horrifically bad.
Hi, who am I speaking with?
Andrew T. Balser.
How old are you, Andrew?
17, I think.
All right. What happened?
Oh, guess the correct term would be, I snapped. I took my little K-bar there and planted it straight into my mother's back. And, my father woke up to her screams. I stabbed the out of him.
It is an all-too-real Halloween horror story. A Winthrop teen is now charged with murdering a couple.
He was a great kid, smart, brilliant, good in school, focused. Was planning on going to college, so it doesn't make sense. It's a shocker that this could happen.
I think what we learned looking over multiple cases of people who are psychopaths is that the families that they are linked to often don't know how much of a psychopath their loved one is. They're normal, and one of the things we do when we're healthy, and sometimes it works to our detriment, is that we tend to assume the good in other people.
I do realize that I just, straight up murdered both of my parents there, so I know I should be having some sort of guilt or remorse, but honestly, at the moment, I just don't feel much of anything.
You can tell he's articulate. He responds very, very quickly. He appears to be quite nimble intellectually. And we do hear the superficial affect. He giggles, laughs, but he's just matter of fact.
And can you tell me everything about
I was sitting there with a knife. I reached out my hand to my mother. She hugged me around the neck there. And I go to hug her, and as I do, I pull up the knife and snap it there.
He discusses walking into his parents' room and his mom hugging him and then him stabbing her in a very shallow and glib way. He almost sounds proud in a way as he's describing what he did. He certainly doesn't sound remorseful.
And you think your mom was disappointed in you, or?
I honestly can't really read people. So I know she was kind of condescending and a bit almost hypocritical in the things she told me. She, was really being no better word than annoying, I suppose.
People with psychopathy do know that they're different, and they do not connect easily to other people. They have usually a superficial relationship with them. Other people may feel that they know them, but from the person with psychopathy's perspective, they don't. People don't know them, and they don't feel connected to other people.
There is an air of entitlement also that comes across because she is most important. And it really doesn't matter who was damaged along the way. She has gotten to where she wants to be, and everybody else should just overlook any dead bodies along the way.
If you have a family member that doesn't connect to the rest of the family, hasn't been exhibiting any real conscience or sense of guilt or remorse for things they've done that have brought harm and problems to the other members of the family, pay attention to that. Sometimes the risk is within.
It begins with a sound no one remembers clearly anymore. A dull thud against winter concrete, swallowed by traffic and wind. The kind of noise a city like Chicago makes 1,000 times a night, unnoticed, unrecorded, except this one mattered. Because when the sun came up on the south side in February of 1985, a young woman was lying behind a shuttered grocery store, coat half-buttoned, one shoe missing, her breath long gone, and the first patrol officer on the scene would later say he knew instantly this wasn't just another crime. This was the kind that sinks its teeth into a city and never really lets go. The neighborhood was already awake, steel gray sky, buses coughing exhaust, factory whistles in the distance, and yellow tape went up fast, flapping like a warning flag, drawing faces to windows, pulling people into doorways, the quiet replaced by whispers that spread block by block. Because the victim wasn't a stranger. She was known, seen, remembered, someone who bought coffee at the same corner, someone whose name would soon be on everyone's lips and then, just as quickly, reduced to a case number, a grainy photo, a cold case waiting to happen. Her name was Margaret Maggie Calloway, 27 years old, a clerk at a downtown insurance office, no criminal record, no known enemies, no dramatic backstory that made sense of what happened to her, and that absence of meaning, that lack of motive, would become the first crack in an investigation that never fully healed. Detectives walked the scene, breath fogging in the cold, photographing scuffed footprints that led nowhere, a smear of blood that stopped too cleanly, like something had been interrupted, like the night itself had flinched. They found no weapon, no purse, no clear sign of struggle beyond bruises already darkening under pale skin. And as radios crackled and squad cars idled, the question hung in the air, sharp and unanswered. Who would do this and why here? Chicago in 1985 was a city used to violence, headlines stacked with murders and missing persons, but this one landed differently because it felt close, intimate, wrong in a way that didn't fade when the tape came down. Maggie had left her office late the night before, coworkers said, a quick goodbye, a promise to call her sister on the weekend, and then she vanished into the routine of buses and sidewalks and streetlights, a routine that failed her. Her body was discovered less than a mile from her apartment, a distance so short it made people uneasy, because it meant safety could evaporate between one block and the next. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, flashing badges, asking the same questions over and over. Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone? Did anything feel off? And the answers came back thin and fragile. A man arguing on the corner, a car idling too long, footsteps running, maybe. Or maybe just the echo of the elevated tracks. Witnesses contradicted each other, timelines slipped, and every lead seemed to dissolve the moment it was touched. In the days that followed, newspapers ran stark headlines, bold black type screaming murder shocks South Side, cold night, cold case in the making, and for a brief moment, it felt like the city was holding its breath. The autopsy brought more questions than answers. Cause of death: blunt force trauma, delivered with enough force to kill but not enough to leave a clear signature, no distinctive pattern, no obvious weapon. There were signs of a struggle, but nothing that pointed cleanly to sexual assault, robbery, or a targeted hit. It was violence without context, a crime stripped of meaning, and that made it harder to solve, because investigators rely on stories, on motives that connect people to actions, and here, the story refused to come together. Suspects came and went. An ex-boyfriend with a temper and an alibi that barely held. A co-worker who lingered too long at her desk. A drifter picked up nearby who matched a vague description, and then didn't. Each one brought a spike of hope, a flurry of paperwork, an interview room lit too bright, and then the slow realization that this, too, was a dead end. Evidence was collected, bagged, labeled, and stored away in boxes that would sit untouched for years, Fingerprints that matched no one, fibers that could have come from anywhere, biological samples taken at a time when science didn't yet know how to listen to what they were saying. As weeks turned into months, the attention faded. Other crimes pushed Maggie's case down the list. Another file in a system already strained to breaking, and the detectives assigned to her death felt the familiar frustration, that grinding sense of failure that comes when effort doesn't equal answers. They met with her family, sat at kitchen tables, drank bad coffee, promised they were still working, promised they wouldn't forget, and meant it, even as the reality of the job pulled them elsewhere. The community didn't forget either, not entirely. People changed their routines, walked in pairs, locked doors earlier, warned their daughters and sisters to be careful. But fear has a shelf life, and over time the shock dulled. Maggie's name stopped appearing in headlines, then in conversations, until it became something older residents mentioned with a shake of the head. A story half remembered, a warning without details. This is how cold cases are born, not in a single moment, but in a slow, almost polite disappearance from public memory. Years passed. The city changed. Buildings were torn down, new ones rose. The grocery store behind which Maggie died was renovated, repainted, its past scrubbed clean by fresh brick and bright signage. Detectives retired, evidence rooms filled, and Maggie Calloway's file gathered dust. A thin folder in a sea of unsolved crimes. Officially open but functionally frozen in time. Then decades later, something shifted. A push from above, a grant, a renewed interest in cold cases as technology advanced, and the promise of modern forensics whispered that the past might not be as silent as everyone thought. Boxes were pulled from shelves, evidence re-examined under new lights, and samples once considered useless were sent to labs that could extract meaning from fragments. DNA, the word itself carried weight now, a near-mythical power to resurrect truth, to name the nameless, to close the open. When Maggie's case resurfaced, it did so quietly at first, a line item on a list, but to those who remembered, to the family who never stopped waiting, it felt like a door creaking open after years sealed shut. Investigators, some young enough to have been children in 1985, read through old reports, listened to crackling tapes, tried to reconstruct a night that had slipped through so many fingers. They walked the route from Maggie's office to her apartment, counting steps, noting sightlines, imagining a city that no longer existed. The lab results came back slowly, deliberately, each one a potential spark. A partial profile here, a comparison there, databases searched and searched again, and then buried in the noise, a match that wasn't a match, not at first, but close enough to demand attention. A familial link, a genetic echo pointing toward someone who had never been questioned, someone who in 1985 had moved through the same streets, breathed the same cold air, and vanished into the anonymity of time. As the pieces began to shift, old assumptions cracked. The theory of a random attack faltered, replaced by something more unsettling, the idea that the killer might have been hiding in plain sight, not a monster lurking in the dark but a man with a job, a routine, a life that continued uninterrupted while Maggie's ended. Investigators followed the thread carefully, aware that cold cases are fragile, that hope can be as dangerous as despair if it's misplaced. The announcement, when it finally came, was brief and heavy with implication. A press conference, microphones clustered, a statement delivered in measured tones. The Chicago Police Department had identified a suspect in the 1985 murder of Margaret Calloway through modern forensic analysis. The words "cold case closed" appeared in headlines within hours, bold and triumphant. A narrative of victory that suggested the long wait was over, that justice, delayed but persistent, had finally arrived. But beneath the surface, the story was far from simple. The suspect was deceased, beyond arrest, beyond trial, beyond the public reckoning that many had imagined for decades. There would be no courtroom drama, no confession aired, no moment where the killer's face matched the fear people had carried for so long. There was only evidence, technical, precise, and for some, insufficient to quiet the doubts that had grown in the silence. For Maggie's family, the news was a collision of relief and grief, answers arriving too late to heal the deepest wounds, closure offered in a form that felt incomplete. For the detectives, it was a professional milestone shadowed by the knowledge of what could never be recovered. And for the city, it reopened an old scar, forcing Chicago to look back at a winter night in 1985 and ask itself whether knowing a name is the same as understanding the truth. The file was marked closed. The box returned to the shelf, this time with a different label. But in the spaces between official statements and lived memory, the case continued to breathe, a reminder that some stories don't end cleanly, that even when science speaks, the past can still whisper, unresolved, into the present, daring anyone who listens to decide whether this cold case was truly solved, or simply given a new ending to an old, unfinished nightmare. The night didn't stay in 1985. It followed people forward, clinging to them in small, quiet ways, in how Maggie's sister still paused when she heard footsteps behind her, in how retired detectives lowered their voices when her name came up, in how the neighborhood itself seemed to flinch when the story resurfaced, because a cold case never really sleeps, it just waits, and when Chicago officials said the file was closed, the word landed with a thud that echoed uncomfortably, because closure suggests finality. And nothing about this felt final. The man identified through modern forensics had lived an ordinary life on paper, steady work, a modest apartment, a string of addresses that traced a slow migration through the city's south and west sides, no arrests tied to violent crime, no headlines. No whispers loud enough to reach the police in 1985, and that ordinariness was what unsettled people most, because it meant the killer wasn't some shadowy outsider. He was woven into the same routines, the same bus schedules, the same corner stores. And the idea that he could move unnoticed for decades made the city feel smaller, more fragile. Investigators revisited old interviews with this new name in mind, scanning transcripts for moments that suddenly glowed with significance. A missed connection here, a dismissive note there, a tip that had been logged and forgotten because it didn't fit the narrative at the time. In one report, a witness mentioned a man watching from across the street, hands in pockets, eyes fixed, a detail that had seemed too vague to chase in a city full of watchers. Now it read differently, heavier, as if the past were rearranging itself to accommodate this new truth. The forensic link was strong, they said. DNA recovered from Maggie's clothing, degraded but persistent, matched through familial searching to a relative who had submitted a sample decades later for an unrelated reason. Science had reached backward through time, drawn a line no one in 1985 could have imagined, and pointed to a man who could no longer speak for himself. That silence became its own kind of noise, because without a confession, without an interrogation, motive remained a question mark, a blank space where meaning should be. Speculation filled the gap. Some believed Maggie had been followed, targeted not for who she was, but for the moment she crossed paths with the wrong person. Others leaned toward a fleeting encounter gone wrong, an argument sparked by nothing more than proximity and chance. Each theory carried its own weight, and none could be proven, leaving the story suspended between fact and imagination, a liminal space cold cases know too well. The community reacted in waves. Older residents nodded grimly, as if this outcome confirmed what they had always suspected, that the truth was uglier and closer than anyone wanted to admit. Younger voices questioned the certainty, asked how a case could be declared closed without a trial, without the public testing of evidence, without the ritual of justice played out under bright courtroom lights. Social media, non-existent in 1985, now amplified every doubt, every alternative theory, every grainy photo pulled from archives and re-examined by armchair investigators hungry for answers. Maggie's story was retold, reshaped by time and technology, her face appearing on screens instead of newsprint, her name trending briefly before slipping again beneath newer tragedies. Yet something had changed. The cold case label, once a marker of neglect, had become a promise, a signal that the past could be reopened, that no crime was truly beyond reach. That promise was powerful and dangerous because it raised expectations that reality couldn't always meet. Inside the department, debates simmered quietly. Some detectives felt vindicated, proud that persistence and progress had finally intersected. Others worried about the precedent, about closing cases on evidence that could never be challenged in court, about the fine line between resolution and convenience. They understood better than anyone that certainty in criminal investigations is often an illusion, a story we tell ourselves to keep moving forward. For Maggie's family, The days after the announcement were a blur of interviews, condolences, and private moments of reckoning. They visited her grave, spoke to her as if she could hear, told her they had a name now, even if they didn't have all the answers. Grief shifted shape, sharpened by the knowledge that the man responsible had lived a full life while she remained forever 27. That imbalance was hard to accept, harder to forgive. The suspects' relatives were pulled into the light as well, forced to confront a legacy they never chose. Some expressed shock, others anger, a few quiet acceptance, each reaction another reminder that violence ripples outward, touching lives far removed from the original act. The city watched, judged, debated, searching for a villain's face, and finding instead a complicated human outline that refused to fit neatly into the role. As weeks passed, the headlines softened, moved on, but the undercurrent remained. Late-night radio shows revisited the case, podcasts dissected every detail, and listeners wrote in with their own memories, their own near misses, their own stories of Chicago nights that could have ended differently. The cold case had become a mirror, reflecting not just one crime, but a collective anxiety about how easily a life can be taken, and how long the truth can hide. In the end, the file sat closed, stamped and dated, a bureaucratic gesture meant to signify completion. Yet for those who looked closely, the edges of the story frayed, threads left untied, questions hovering just beyond reach. The killer had been identified, yes, but understanding lagged behind, limping, incomplete, and the space between those two things was where the unease lived. Chicago kept moving, as it always does, trains rattling, sirens wailing, winter giving way to spring, but somewhere in that motion, the memory of Maggie Calloway lingered, a quiet presence reminding anyone willing to listen that some cold cases don't end with certainty. They end with a deeper awareness of how much we don't know, and how the past, no matter how carefully boxed and labeled, has a way of breathing through the cracks, waiting for the next moment to remind us it's still there. Time did what it always does after the cameras leave. It stretched, thinned, and settled into corners, and as Chicago absorbed the idea that a killer had been identified but never confronted, the city slipped into a strange aftershock. A phase where answers existed on paper, but refused to live comfortably in people's minds. The cold case was technically closed, but conversations kept reopening it, in kitchens and bars and late-night train rides, because the human need for narrative is stronger than any official stamp. Investigators began to feel that tension almost immediately. Requests came in from journalists asking for clarification, for just one more detail, one more confirmation that the science was airtight. The language of probability and statistics didn't translate well into grief or fear, and phrases like high degree of certainty and consistent with felt flimsy when weighed against a death that had haunted a city for decades. Every answer seemed to generate two new questions, each one probing the same wound from a different angle. Old case files were reread again, not just by police but by anyone with access to archives and a restless curiosity. Amateur sleuths mapped timelines, compared bus routes, highlighted gaps, searching for the moment when Maggie's path intersected fatally with the man now named as her killer. Some claimed to find inconsistencies, others saw patterns that confirmed their worst suspicions. The internet turned the cold case into a living organism, constantly fed by speculation, incapable of staying still. The lack of a confession loomed large. In other cases, a killer's words, however self-serving or cruel, provide a twisted form of clarity. Here, there was only silence. The suspect's death years earlier meant motives could only be inferred, reconstructed from fragments of behavior and circumstance. Was it rage, opportunity, fixation, chance? Each possibility painted a different version of the same night, and none could be proven beyond doubt. Detectives revisited the geography of the crime, tracing Maggie's last known movements with renewed focus. They studied streetlight placement as it had been in 1985, blind spots that no longer existed, alleys now filled with businesses and noise. They asked whether the location suggested familiarity, whether the killer had known that stretch of pavement well enough to act quickly and disappear. The answers were suggestive but never definitive, shadows overlapping without resolving into a clear shape. The forensic evidence itself became a character in the story, imbued with almost mystical authority by those desperate for certainty. DNA had become synonymous with truth in the public imagination, a final word immune to bias or error. Experts tried to temper that belief, explaining degradation, partial profiles, the limitations of familial searches, but nuance struggled to compete with the simplicity of headlines. Cold case closed sounded better than cold case complicated. For Maggie's family, the days blurred into a careful balancing act between public expectation and private grief. They were asked how it felt to finally have answers, as if answers were a single, solid thing. Some days, it felt like relief, a release from decades of not knowing. Other days, it felt like reopening a wound that had at least scabbed over. The absence of a trial denied them the ritual of justice, the chance to sit in a courtroom and watch accountability take form. In quiet moments, they questioned the past, replayed memories with a sharper edge. Had Maggie mentioned someone who made her uneasy? Had there been a detail dismissed too quickly, because it seemed insignificant at the time? Memory, already unreliable, became a minefield, each step threatening to detonate regret. They reminded themselves that blame lay with the killer, not with missed signs or unanswered calls, but the mind doesn't always listen to reason. The suspect's life, now scrutinized in retrospect, offered little clarity. No obvious escalation, no pattern of known violence, no trail of victims waiting to be uncovered. That absence unsettled investigators almost as much as the crime itself. Serial offenders leave breadcrumbs. This man seemed to have left none. It raised the possibility that Maggie's murder was an isolated eruption, a single catastrophic decision that ended one life and quietly reshaped another, unseen by the system meant to catch it. Community meetings were held, some formal, others impromptu, spaces where people voiced anger, doubt, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. Residents asked whether there were other cases like Maggie's, other files waiting for the right technology to unlock them. Police representatives spoke about resources, about the commitment to revisiting unsolved crimes, but reassurance felt thin against the reality that time erodes evidence and memory alike. The phrase cold case began to shift in meaning. It no longer suggested abandonment so much as dormancy, a reminder that the past could be stirred awake under the right conditions. That realization was both comforting and unsettling. If Maggie's case could resurface after so long, so could others, and with them, the possibility that justice is always provisional, subject to revision as tools and perspectives change. Privately, some detectives wrestled with doubt. Not doubt in the science, but in the finality of the conclusion. They knew how investigations evolve, how new information can reframe old assumptions. Declaring a case closed is as much an administrative decision as a moral one, a line drawn to allow institutions to move on. Whether the truth fully aligns with that line is another matter entirely. As seasons turned, the intensity faded again, the story slipping back toward the margins. But it didn't disappear. It lingered in the background, resurfacing whenever discussions turned to crime, to safety, to the promises and limits of technology. Maggie Calloway's name became shorthand for a certain kind of unresolved resolution. A case cited in debates about what justice looks like when the traditional endpoints are out of reach. Late at night, when the city quieted just enough for old echoes to resurface, the questions returned. If the killer had lived openly among them, what did that say about the nature of danger? If science could speak decades later, what other truths were waiting, buried in evidence rooms and forgotten boxes? And if a case could be closed without ever truly ending, where did that leave the living, still carrying the weight of a winter night in 1985 that refused to stay in the past? The cold case remained, not as an open file, but as a presence, a reminder that closure is not an event but a process, uneven and imperfect. Chicago had learned the killer's name, but the story continued to breathe in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between progress and loss, an unfinished murmur beneath the city's constant noise, waiting, always waiting, for someone to decide whether knowing is ever enough. By the fourth decade after Maggie Calloway died, the case had settled into a peculiar state, neither fully alive nor truly buried, a cold case that refused to stay cold, and within the department, a small group of investigators kept returning to it, not because they were assigned, but because something about it resisted rest. They talked about it in hallways, over late dinners, in the pauses between other work, circling the same unanswered questions like a habit they couldn't break. What troubled them most was not the DNA, but the gaps that surrounded it. The sample tied the suspect to Maggie, yes, but it did not explain how they met, what words were exchanged, what moment tipped the night from ordinary to fatal. Without that context, the crime felt suspended, like a photograph taken just after impact, motion frozen but force still implied. It was enough for an official conclusion, but not enough to quiet an investigator's instincts. They pulled the evidence again, handling it with a care that bordered on reverence. Clothing fibers were re-examined, old photographs scanned at higher resolutions, notes written in long-retired detectives' handwriting studied, as if they might contain hidden emphasis. In one margin, someone had underlined a sentence about Maggie being followed in the weeks before her death, a rumor dismissed at the time as paranoia or coincidence. Now it glowed with renewed intensity, a detail that refused to stay quiet. The rumor had come from a co-worker, a woman who remembered Maggie mentioning a man on her commute, someone she noticed more than once, never close enough to confront, never obvious enough to report. The description was vague, almost useless, but it planted a seed. Had Maggie sensed something before anyone else did? Had she been targeted, selected not randomly but deliberately, by someone who learned her routine slowly, patiently? Investigators tried to reconstruct the suspect's movements in 1985, a task made difficult by time and incomplete records. Employment files were partial, addresses overlapping, dates blurred. Still, patterns emerged, not conclusive but suggestive. He had worked near Maggie's route, frequented areas she passed through, existed within the same urban rhythms. Proximity alone doesn't make a killer, but in the absence of other explanations, it carried weight. The possibility of stalking changed the emotional temperature of the case. A random act of violence is terrifying, but impersonal. A targeted one implies intention, planning, a psychological presence long before the physical attack. It suggested Maggie might not have been unlucky, but chosen, a thought that unsettled her family and the community alike. It meant danger could be quiet, observant, embedded in routine. Experts weighed in, careful with their language, pointing out that stalking behaviors are often invisible until after the fact, recognized only in hindsight. They spoke about missed opportunities, about how awareness and reporting standards were different in the 1980s, about how many warning signs we now recognize simply didn't have names back then. The past, they reminded everyone, is a foreign country with its own rules. Still, the question lingered. If Maggie had been followed, why was there no record, no corroboration, no earlier incident? Some suggested she might have brushed it off, not wanting to seem dramatic, not wanting to worry her family. Others argued the rumor was just that, an echo amplified by grief and time. The truth sat somewhere between, unreachable. The suspect's death complicated everything. Without the ability to question him, every theory became speculative, every conclusion provisional. Psychologists offered profiles based on known behavior, but profiles are approximations, shadows cast by incomplete light. They could not account for a single, catastrophic choice that left no other trace. Public trust wavered in subtle ways. People wanted to believe in the power of modern forensics, wanted the reassurance that science could correct the failures of the past. At the same time, they sensed the fragility of that belief. DNA can place someone at a moment, but it cannot speak to intent, emotion, or circumstance. It can tell you who, but rarely why. For Maggie's sister, the speculation was exhausting. Each new angle reopened questions she had spent years trying to put down. She remembered Maggie as cautious, observant, not prone to fear without reason. That memory lent weight to the idea that Maggie had sensed something was wrong. Yet it also sharpened the pain, because if Maggie knew even vaguely, then her final days were colored by unease, by the feeling of being watched, a burden no one should carry unknowingly. Anniversaries came and went, marked quietly by those who still remembered. Flowers appeared near the site where Maggie was found. Anonymous offerings left by hands that wanted to acknowledge a life interrupted. The grocery store's new owners knew little of the history, but the spot itself seemed to draw remembrance. a small pocket of stillness in a busy neighborhood. Within police circles, Maggie's case began to be cited in training sessions, a cautionary example of how investigations can stall, how evidence that seems useless can later become pivotal, and how declaring closure doesn't erase complexity. Recruits listened, absorbing the lesson that certainty is rare and humility essential. The phrase "cold case closed" took on a different tone in these conversations. It sounded less like triumph and more like compromise, a recognition that the system had reached the limits of what it could prove. That didn't mean the truth was fully known, only that it had been narrowed, framed as tightly as circumstances allowed. As time pressed on, the city continued its relentless reinvention, but beneath the noise and motion, Maggie Calloway's story remained a quiet current. It flowed through debates about justice, through family dinners where her name was still spoken, through the private thoughts of investigators who wondered what they might have missed. The cold case had been closed, but the night itself stayed open, its details flickering just out of reach, a reminder that some crimes leave behind not answers, but questions that evolve, deepen, and refuse to be silenced, even as the world insists on moving forward. The 5th year after the announcement brought an unexpected turn, not in evidence, but in memory, the most fragile and dangerous element of any cold case. A man called into a local radio show late one night, his voice unsteady, claiming he had known Maggie Calloway, not well, not personally, but enough to remember something that had never sat right with him. He didn't give his full name, only said he'd lived nearby in 1985, and had seen Maggie arguing with a man weeks before her death. A man who wasn't her boyfriend. A man who seemed angry in a way that lingered. The call was dismissed by some as attention-seeking, another ghost story surfacing decades too late, but it caught the ear of a retired detective who had never truly let the case go. He replayed the recording, listened to the pauses, the way the caller described the man's posture, the way Maggie had leaned back slightly, as if guarding her space. Details like that are hard to fabricate convincingly, and the detective felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sense that the past was nudging the present again. The tip was forwarded, logged, examined, and while it didn't introduce new evidence, it added texture, a human layer to a case increasingly defined by lab reports and press statements. Investigators compared the caller's description to old photographs, to the suspect's known appearance in the mid-1980s. The match wasn't perfect, but memory rarely is. What mattered was the implication. That Maggie's final weeks may not have been as uneventful as records suggested. This possibility reframed earlier assumptions. If Maggie had confronted or rejected someone, the crime took on a sharper edge, less random, more personal. It suggested escalation, a moment where something simmering finally boiled over. That narrative fit the violence of the act, the lack of theft, the proximity to her home. It also raised questions about how many warnings go unheard because they don't yet have a name. The department debated whether to acknowledge the call publicly. On one hand, transparency had become a priority, a way to maintain trust in the wake of doubts. On the other, opening the door to late-breaking memories risked unleashing a flood of unreliable accounts. In the end, they chose silence, a decision that frustrated some and reassured others. Cold cases live in that tension between openness and control. Maggie's family heard about the call anyway. In cases like this, information has a way of leaking, carried by well-meaning friends or whispered through networks of shared grief. Her sister listened to the recording with a careful neutrality, trying not to project meaning onto every inflection. She remembered Maggie mentioning an uncomfortable encounter once, a passing comment she'd brushed off at the time. Now it returned with weight, pressing against the edges of what she thought she knew. Grief is not static. It shifts when new information appears, even decades later. For Maggie's family, the idea that she might have been frightened, might have felt threatened and still continued her routine, added a layer of sorrow that felt almost unbearable. It wasn't just that she died, it was that she may have sensed danger and lacked the tools, the language, or the support to escape it. The suspect's timeline was scrutinized again, this time with an eye toward behavior rather than just location. Co-workers from the era were tracked down, some surprised to be contacted after so long. Most remembered little, faces blurring together across the years, but a few recalled him as intense, quiet, prone to holding grudges. None remembered overt violence. It was the kind of characterization that fits countless people, useful only in how it failed to rule him out. Psychologists weighed in again, speaking about how certain offenders operate within narrow windows, how a single triggering event can precipitate an act that is never repeated. The public struggled with that idea. It felt unsatisfying, unfair, to imagine that someone could commit a murder and then return to normalcy, untouched by consequence. Yet history offered plenty of examples. Violence does not always announce itself with patterns. The case's renewed visibility began to influence broader conversations about cold cases nationwide. Maggie Calloway became a reference point in articles about the limits of forensic certainty, about the ethical implications of declaring closure when prosecution is impossible. Her story was used to argue for more resources, for better preservation of evidence, for a more nuanced public understanding of what solving a crime can actually mean. Meanwhile, the city's relationship with the case evolved. Younger residents, encountering the story for the first time, saw it less as a personal tragedy and more as a symbol, an illustration of systemic failure and belated progress. Older residents felt a quieter, heavier response, the weight of memory layered with the unease of knowing that some truths arrive too late to matter in the ways we want them to. Late one evening, a small vigil formed near the site where Maggie was found. There was no official announcement, no media presence, just a handful of people holding candles, standing in a loose circle, sharing silence. Someone read Maggie's name aloud. Another spoke briefly about the cold night in 1985, about how the city had changed. The vigil ended without speeches or resolutions, leaving behind melted wax and a sense of unfinished business. Within the department, Maggie's case continued to shape how cold cases were approached. Younger detectives were encouraged to think creatively, to revisit old assumptions, to respect the stories embedded in files as much as the evidence itself. Veterans cautioned against overconfidence, reminding them that every conclusion is provisional, subject to revision by new information or new ways of seeing. The phrase "killer identified" remained technically accurate, but emotionally incomplete. Identification without confrontation left a vacuum, a space where accountability should have been. That absence became part of the case's legacy, a reminder that justice is not a single outcome but a spectrum, and sometimes we are forced to settle for its faintest expression. As winter returned each year, the memory of Maggie's death sharpened, cold air carrying echoes of that first morning when she was found. People who never knew her felt the chill anyway, an inherited unease passed down through stories and headlines. The city remembered, then forgot, then remembered again, caught in a loop that mirrored the investigation itself. The cold case, closed in name, remained open in practice, a living example of how truth can emerge without resolution, how answers can coexist with doubt. Maggie Calloway's story did not move toward a neat ending. Instead, it spread outward, touching conversations about safety, memory, and the quiet ways violence shapes a community long after the sirens fade, leaving behind a question that refused to disappear. When we say a case is closed, what are we really closing? And what are we leaving behind? The sixth movement of the story unfolded without fanfare, quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the case itself resisted being stirred again. And yet it was stirred, not by evidence this time, but by absence. Someone noticed that one piece of Maggie Calloway's property, listed in early reports, had never been accounted for, a small detail buried in paperwork from 1985, overlooked because it seemed insignificant then, but now under the harsh light of hindsight. It felt like a loose thread begging to be pulled. It was a watch, inexpensive, silver-toned, something Maggie wore daily according to her sister, something that marked time in the most ordinary way. The report noted it was missing from the body, assumed taken during the incident or lost in the chaos. No follow-up was recorded. No pawnshop canvas, no recovered property log. In a city drowning in violent crime, small things slip through cracks, and this was one of them. The watch became symbolic, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. If it had been taken intentionally, it suggested something personal, a souvenir, a moment of possession. If it had been lost earlier, it might point to an interaction before the fatal one. Either way, it was a marker of time, a reminder that every cold case is measured not just in years, but in missed moments. Investigators revisited the early hours after Maggie's death, reconstructing the flow of decisions made under pressure. They noted how quickly the scene had been processed, how assumptions formed in the absence of clear direction. In 1985, the priority was volume, not perfection. Cases moved fast or they stalled. Maggie's had stalled, and with it, certain questions were never asked loudly enough. The suspect's known habits were examined again, this time with an eye toward keepsakes. There was no record of trophies, no items recovered after his death that linked him to Maggie beyond the DNA. His apartment had been cleared years earlier, possessions dispersed or discarded, any physical reminder of the crime erased by time and ordinary life. If the watch had existed, it was gone now, dissolved into the anonymity of decades. That disappearance fed doubt. Some argued it was further proof of guilt, that the killer had taken something small, private, something that only mattered to the victim. Others saw it as another example of how incomplete early investigations can distort later interpretations. Without the object itself, meaning became speculative, shaped by the needs of the narrative rather than certainty. The discussion spilled beyond the case, into broader debates about evidence preservation and institutional memory. Maggie's file became a teaching tool again, cited in conferences and seminars as an example of how minor details can grow in importance over time. Younger detectives listened, absorbing the lesson that no detail is truly small, only temporarily misunderstood. For Maggie's family, the talk of the watch reopened a different kind of wound. It was something tangible, something she had touched, something that had been part of her daily life. The idea that it vanished along with her final hours made her absence feel sharper, more intimate. They imagined her checking the time, waiting for a bus, unaware of how close the end was. That image lingered, painful and persistent. As the case's cultural footprint grew, artists and writers began to reference it indirectly, weaving elements into fiction, songs, and essays about unsolved violence and delayed justice. Maggie's name wasn't always used, but the outline was recognizable. A young woman, a city, a promise of closure that arrived too late to satisfy. The story took on a life beyond the facts, a testament to how true crime narratives can both illuminate and obscure. Critics pushed back against what they saw as romanticization, warning that the focus on mystery risked overshadowing the victim's humanity. They argued that Maggie should be remembered not as a symbol or a case study, but as a person with a life interrupted. That tension between story and reality became another layer of the cold case's legacy. Within the department, fatigue set in. Not the exhaustion of long hours, but the weariness of circling the same unanswered questions. Some investigators felt it was time to let the case rest, to accept that no further clarity would come. Others resisted, driven by the belief that unresolved details, however small, mattered. The debate was quiet, internal, but persistent. The city itself seemed indifferent on the surface, moving through its cycles of news and noise. Yet beneath that indifference, Maggie's case had become part of Chicago's collective subconscious. It surfaced whenever another cold case was reopened, whenever forensic technology made headlines, whenever someone asked whether justice has an expiration date. One evening, a young detective stood near the site of the murder, watching people pass by, none of them aware of what had happened there decades earlier. The streetlight cast a familiar pool of yellow, different fixtures, same effect. He wondered what Maggie had seen in her final moments, whether she had recognized her attacker, whether she had thought of home. These questions had no investigative value, but they mattered all the same. The suspect's name, now firmly attached to the case, began to fade from conversation, replaced again by Maggie's. That shift felt important. It suggested a refocusing, a move away from the perpetrator and back toward the life that had been taken. In that sense, the cold case evolved, its center of gravity changing even as its answers remained fixed. As years continued to stack up, the watch remained missing, a small absence casting a long shadow. It was mentioned less often, then only in footnotes, then not at all, but for those who knew the file intimately, it lingered, a reminder that closure is often an agreement we make with ourselves, not a state achieved through facts alone. The sixth chapter of the case did not bring revelation or resolution. Instead, it deepened the silence, adding texture to the unanswered, reinforcing the idea that some truths dissolve rather than reveal themselves. Maggie Calloway's cold case remained closed in the ledger, but open in the mind, a quiet, persistent ticking beneath the city's noise, like a watch that keeps time even after it's been lost, marking the distance between what we know and what we will never fully understand. The seventh turn came from a place no one expected, not a lab or an archive, but a routine audit, the kind of bureaucratic exercise designed to tidy records rather than reopen wounds. An evidence clerk noticed a discrepancy while cross-referencing old inventories, a box number that didn't align with its contents, a chain of custody form amended in a different ink. It was minor, the sort of thing that happens when decades stack up, but in a case built on fragments, even small irregularities carried weight. The box held soil samples collected near Maggie's body, preserved in sealed envelopes that smelled faintly of age and paper. In 1985, they had been analyzed for trace evidence and deemed unremarkable. Now, with modern techniques, they were tested again, not because anyone expected a breakthrough, but because procedure demanded completeness. The results came back ambiguous, inconclusive, and yet unsettling. There were particles inconsistent with the immediate scene, traces that suggested Maggie had been on a different surface earlier that night, somewhere not yet identified. The finding didn't contradict the existing conclusion, but it complicated it. If Maggie had been moved, even briefly, the geography of the crime shifted, opening new questions about opportunity and control. Investigators debated the implications quietly, aware that reopening the spatial narrative risked unraveling years of accepted assumptions. The public had grown weary of revisions. Certainty, even imperfect, had become a comfort. Still, the idea lingered. They revisited maps, old and new, overlaying them to reconstruct the city as it had been in 1985. Vacant lots long since built over, industrial yards now converted into condos, stretches of asphalt that once bore no cameras, no witnesses. Somewhere in that vanished landscape might be a missing chapter, a place where Maggie's path bent before it ended. The suspect's known movements were re-examined again, this time with that possibility in mind. He had access to vehicles through work, something that hadn't seemed important before. He had been familiar with industrial zones, places where a brief stop would go unnoticed. None of it was proof, but it offered a scenario more complex than a sudden encounter on a quiet street. Complexity in this case felt closer to truth. As word of the audit leaked, skepticism resurfaced. Critics accused the department of moving goalposts, of searching for drama where none was needed. Supporters argued the opposite, that honesty required acknowledging uncertainty wherever it appeared. The cold case became a litmus test for public trust, a measure of how much ambiguity people were willing to tolerate in exchange for transparency. For Maggie's family, the new information landed softly but heavily. They had learned to brace for updates, to receive them without expectation. The possibility that Maggie had been somewhere else, even briefly, before she died stirred a fresh wave of imagination. Images they didn't want but couldn't avoid. It also raised a painful question. Had she had a chance to escape, to be seen, to be helped? Investigators tried to answer that question through probability, modeling timelines and distances, but probability offered little comfort. It reduced human moments to percentages, stripped of fear and hope. In the end, they could only say that movement was possible, not proven. Another maybe added to a long list of maybes. The media seized on the nuance, framing it as a twist, a new angle in an old story. Headlines flirted with implication, careful not to contradict the official conclusion while hinting at hidden layers. The phrase cold case closed was repeated with an asterisk, a verbal shrug that acknowledged both resolution and doubt. The audience, long accustomed to certainty in true crime narratives, struggled with the ambiguity. Within the department, the audit prompted introspection. How many other cases carried similar quiet inconsistencies, buried not by malice but by time? How many conclusions rested on foundations that would look less solid under modern scrutiny? Maggie's case became a mirror, reflecting institutional vulnerability as much as investigative persistence. A few detectives advocated for a formal addendum to the case file. a document outlining unresolved questions and alternative scenarios. It was an unusual proposal, one that challenged the binary logic of solved versus unsolved. After debate, a compromise was reached. The addendum would exist, but quietly, accessible to those who sought it, a footnote to closure rather than a public retraction. That footnote mattered. It acknowledged that truth can be layered, that identifying a killer does not erase uncertainty about the path that led there. It allowed the case to breathe again, not as a failure, but as an honest accounting of what was known and what remained out of reach. As time passed, the soil samples returned to storage, their brief moment in the spotlight over. The discrepancy was corrected, the ledger balanced. On paper, nothing had changed. But in the minds of those closest to the case, the narrative had shifted subtly, expanded to include movement, possibility, and a deeper appreciation for how fragile reconstruction can be. Late one night, an investigator stood alone in the evidence room, surrounded by shelves of boxed lives and interrupted stories. Maggie Calloway's file rested among them, familiar and heavy. He understood then that cold cases are not puzzles waiting to be solved, but conversations extended across generations, shaped by the tools and values of each era. The seventh phase ended without answers, but with a quieter kind of honesty. The case was not reopened, not reclassified, but re-understood, its edges softened by acknowledgement of uncertainty. Chicago absorbed that understanding slowly, imperfectly, learning again that closure is often an approximation, a best effort made in the face of time's erosion. Maggie's story continued to exist in that space, between what could be proven and what could only be imagined. A reminder that even when a killer is named, the night itself may never fully give up its secrets, and the city must learn to live with the echoes, unresolved but not unheard. The eighth passage of the story arrived with a quieter weight, the kind that doesn't announce itself but settles slowly, as if the case had begun to age again in real time. The flurry of audits, theories, and renewed scrutiny receded, leaving behind a residue of awareness that changed how people spoke about Maggie Calloway, how they framed the cold case not as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be acknowledged. Inside the department, the detectives who had lived with the case longest noticed a shift in themselves. They no longer chased revelations. Instead, they guarded what remained, the integrity of the record, the careful language that distinguished fact from inference. Maggie's file was no longer a candidate for dramatic breakthroughs. It was a lesson, a boundary marker showing where effort ends and humility begins. That restraint did not sit easily with the public. True crime culture, now fully mature, thrived on twists and confessions, on the illusion that every mystery can be cracked if you just dig hard enough. Maggie's story resisted that appetite. It offered no villain to confront, no final scene to replay. It asked listeners to sit with uncertainty, and many found that deeply uncomfortable. Documentary crews came and went, their questions circling the same points, their cameras lingering on the same streets. Some projects stalled when producers realized there would be no dramatic payoff. Others leaned into the ambiguity, framing the case as a meditation on time, memory, and loss. Maggie's face appeared again in black and white photos, her smile frozen, her life reduced to a symbol she never agreed to represent. Her family learned to decline most requests. They had given enough of their grief to the public record. What remained was theirs alone, the private knowledge of who Maggie was beyond the headlines, the small habits and plans that never made it into case files. They spoke of her less as a victim now and more as a presence, someone who still occupied space in their conversations and choices. In the neighborhood where Maggie died, the story thinned with each passing year. New residents moved in, unaware of what had happened on that stretch of sidewalk decades earlier. The streetlight was replaced, the pavement resurfaced. Only a few older locals remembered, and even they spoke of it softly, as if raising their voices might disturb something better left alone. Yet traces remained. A community mural painted nearby included a subtle reference, a small figure rendered in muted tones, unnamed but unmistakable to those who knew. It wasn't official, not sanctioned, just an artist's quiet acknowledgement that the ground held history. People passed it every day without noticing, which felt appropriate. Memory doesn't always demand attention. Sometimes it just wants space. The suspect's name faded further, appearing less often in discussions, replaced by broader questions about systems and time. His life, once dissected for clues, receded into irrelevance. That too felt like a kind of justice denying him the permanence of infamy. What remained was the impact of his act, measured not in his biography, but in the absence it created. In academic circles, Maggie's case was cited in studies about cold case resolution and its psychological effects on communities. Researchers noted the phenomenon of partial closure, the way answers without confrontation can soothe and unsettle simultaneously. They spoke about narrative satisfaction and its absence, about how unresolved endings linger longer in the mind than neat conclusions. Those observations found echoes in the city itself. Chicago had lived with enough violence to recognize the difference between resolution and peace. Maggie's case had achieved the former without fully granting the latter. It was a reminder that justice systems operate on evidence and thresholds, while human experience operates on emotion and meaning, two scales that rarely align perfectly. For one retired detective, now far removed from the rhythms of the job, Maggie's case became a touchstone in his reflections on career and purpose. He thought about all the nights spent chasing leads, the files closed with confidence that later felt misplaced. Maggie's story taught him that solving a case is not the same as understanding it, and that sometimes the most honest outcome is an incomplete one. As the years edged forward, new technologies emerged, promising deeper insights, finer detail. There was brief speculation about whether Maggie's evidence might be tested again, whether another layer of truth waited to be uncovered. The idea surfaced, then settled, met with a collective sense that enough had been taken from the past. Not every advance needs to be applied. Not every question needs to be forced open. The cold case, once defined by its silence, now existed in a quieter register, less about what was unknown and more about how that unknown had shaped those who lived with it. Maggie Calloway had become part of the city's moral landscape, a reference point for discussions about patience, restraint, and the limits of certainty. On winter nights, when the air cut sharply and the city lights reflected off wet pavement, the story felt closer. People spoke about safety, about routines, about the thin line between ordinary and catastrophic. Maggie's name surfaced then, not dramatically but as a reminder, a shorthand for vigilance and compassion. The eighth phase did not add facts or names. It added distance, perspective, the slow understanding that some stories change not through discovery, but through time's quiet work. Maggie's case had moved from investigation to memory, from urgency to reflection, carrying with it the unresolved weight of a night that could be named but never fully known. The cold case remained closed officially and firmly, yet it lingered in a softer form, embedded in the city's consciousness, a story told less often but felt more deeply. And in that lingering, Maggie Calloway continued to exist, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a life remembered, her absence shaping the space around it, long after the noise had faded and the questions learned to live without answers. The ninth stretch of the story unfolded not through discovery, but through contrast, as the city confronted new crimes with tools Maggie Calloway never had. And each comparison sharpened the outline of what had been missing in 1985. Every time a suspect was identified within hours, every time footage replayed a crime from 3 angles, Maggie's case resurfaced quietly, a reminder of how differently that winter night might have ended in another era. Younger detectives spoke about it in almost theoretical terms, as a benchmark for how far policing had come and how far it still had to go. Body cameras, license plate readers, real-time data analysis, all of it seemed to promise a future where cold cases would be rarer, shorter-lived. And yet, even as technology advanced, Maggie's story cautioned against that optimism, because tools do not eliminate chance, and violence still finds gaps. The public noticed the contrast too. Online discussions framed Maggie's death as an example of timing's cruelty, how being born just a little earlier can mean the difference between answers and silence. That framing was meant to be sympathetic, but it carried an uncomfortable implication. That justice is partly a matter of luck, distributed unevenly across generations. In community forums, older residents pushed back. They reminded younger voices that technology doesn't replace attention, that cameras don't matter if no one is watching, that data doesn't help if assumptions blind investigators to alternative explanations. Maggie's case, they argued, wasn't just about outdated tools, it was about human limits, bias, and the chaos of real life intruding on procedural order. That debate spilled into policy discussions. Funding for cold case units was proposed, justified in part by stories like Maggie's, where delayed answers still mattered. Advocates spoke about dignity, about the obligation to pursue truth even when it arrives too late to punish. Skeptics questioned cost and impact, asking what closure truly provides when consequences are no longer possible. Maggie's family followed these debates from a distance. They had learned that public interest ebbs and flows, attaching itself to broader movements more than individual lives. Still, there was a quiet comfort in knowing that Maggie's name contributed to change, that her story might help others avoid the same limbo. It didn't erase the loss, but it gave it a fragile kind of meaning. Meanwhile, the physical artifacts of the case continued to age. Evidence bags yellowed, labels faded, digital files migrated from one system to another. Preservation became an act of faith, a belief that maintaining these fragments mattered even if they were never used again. Maggie's file survived multiple transitions, each one a small victory against institutional forgetting. An unexpected letter arrived at the department during this period, handwritten, careful, from a woman who had lived in the same building as the suspect in the late 1980s. She wrote about an argument she remembered, loud enough to wake her, a man shouting at someone she couldn't see, rage spilling into the hallway. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now, after reading about Maggie's case, the memory returned with force. The letter was read, logged, assessed, and ultimately classified as anecdotal. There was no way to connect it definitively to Maggie, no date, no name, no corroboration. Still, it was added to the quiet archive of maybes. Another voice arriving too late to change outcomes but too sincere to ignore entirely. For investigators, moments like that underscored the emotional gravity of cold cases. Every new memory carried hope and disappointment in equal measure. A reminder that truth is often distributed across people who don't realize its value until years later. Maggie's case had become a magnet for these delayed recollections, each one a fragment of a night that refused to settle. The city itself absorbed these echoes unevenly. Some neighborhoods embraced the lessons, organizing walks, installing better lighting, fostering a sense of collective watchfulness. Others moved on, overwhelmed by present concerns. Chicago has always been a city of simultaneous realities, and Maggie's story lived among them, present for some, invisible to others. As the years continued, anniversaries grew quieter. There were fewer articles, fewer posts, fewer conversations. That silence worried some, who feared that forgetting would undo what little progress had been made. Others saw it as a sign of healing, a gradual release from a story that had demanded attention for too long. One evening, during a routine patrol, an officer paused near the site of Maggie's death, not because he recognized it, but because something in the space felt heavy, an intuition he couldn't explain. He stood there for a moment, then moved on, unaware of the history beneath his feet. The city doesn't announce its ghosts. It carries them silently, trusting time to decide who remembers. In academic lectures and training sessions, Maggie's case was now framed as an ethical example. What does it mean to declare victory when accountability is impossible? How should institutions communicate certainty when certainty has limits? Students debated these questions earnestly, using Maggie's story as a reference point, a way to grapple with abstract ideas through a real human cost. The ninth phase of the case did not bring resolution or revelation. It brought comparison, reflection, and a sharper understanding of absence. Maggie Calloway's death had become a measuring stick, not for success, but for humility, a reminder that progress does not retroactively heal the past. The cold case remained closed, its status unchanged, but its meaning continued to evolve. Each new crime solved quickly cast a longer shadow backward, illuminating what Maggie's case lacked and what it taught in return. The story pressed on, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. That justice is shaped as much by time and context as by effort, and that some lives are lost in the spaces where systems, eras, and human limits collide. And so the city carried on, layered with old and new stories, Maggie's among them, quieter now, but still present, a low, persistent hum beneath the noise, reminding anyone who listened that the past never fully releases its hold. It simply changes the way it speaks. The 10th phase arrived almost imperceptibly, not as a new chapter but as a thinning of urgency, the slow realization that the case had entered a different kind of time. Maggie Calloway's story no longer moved with investigation or debate. It moved with memory, carried forward by those who chose to hold it, and released by those who didn't. This, too, was part of the life cycle of a cold case, the moment when effort gives way to endurance. Within the department, Maggie's file was rarely pulled now. When it was for reasons that had little to do with her death itself. New detectives studied it to understand process, not to find answers. Supervisors referenced it in conversations about language, about how words like solved and closed land on people who live with consequences long after paperwork is finalized. The case had become institutional lore, stripped of immediacy, but heavy with implication. The detectives who once chased its shadows felt the shift most keenly. Retirement had taken some of them. Others moved on to different roles, different cities, different lives. Yet Maggie's name followed them, resurfacing unexpectedly, in questions from students, in interviews about their careers, in moments when they reflected on what success in law enforcement actually means. The case lingered not because it was unsolved, but because it resisted being simplified. For Maggie's family, time had done what it always does, softened some edges and sharpened others. The raw shock of loss had long since transformed into something steadier, a grief that lived alongside ordinary days. The announcement years earlier had not closed the wound, but it had altered its shape. There was less not knowing now, but knowing had come without justice, and that imbalance never quite settled. They marked anniversaries quietly, privately. There were no press statements, no public appeals. Just small rituals, shared meals, stories told to keep Maggie present in ways that had nothing to do with her death. They learned over time to separate her life from the case, to insist that she be remembered for more than the manner in which she died. That insistence was its own form of resistance. The broader public, meanwhile, absorbed Maggie's story into a larger narrative about crime and time. It became one example among many, cited when discussing advances in forensic science, or the ethics of posthumous identification. Her name appeared in footnotes, in sidebars, in quiet acknowledgments that progress often arrives unevenly. Familiarity dulled the shock, but not the significance. Occasionally, a journalist would revisit the case, framing it as a retrospective, a look back at how far things had come. Those pieces tended to focus on technology, on databases and breakthroughs, on the triumph of modern methods over past limitations. They mentioned Maggie, but often briefly, her humanity compressed to make room for systems and tools. Readers consumed these stories quickly, then moved on. There were moments of pushback. Letters to editors, comments online. Voices insisting that Maggie not be reduced to a data point in a success narrative. They argued that identifying a killer without accountability is not triumph, that closure imposed from above does not always align with lived experience. These objections rarely gained traction, but they existed, persistent and necessary. In the neighborhood where Maggie died, the story had almost completely dissolved. New businesses came and went. Children played on sidewalks where investigators once stood. The ground itself seemed indifferent, bearing no visible mark of what had happened. Only the oldest residents remembered, and even they spoke of it less often now, as if the words had grown too heavy to carry casually. Yet the city retained the story in subtler ways. It surfaced in training manuals, in policy discussions, in the quiet caution exercised by detectives who had learned not to promise more than they could deliver. Maggie's case influenced decisions far removed from her life, shaping how others were investigated, how evidence was preserved, how conclusions were framed. There was a particular phrase that began to appear in internal documents: administratively closed, investigatively resolved. It was careful, precise, an attempt to acknowledge what the case was and what it wasn't. Language evolved because it had to, because Maggie's story exposed the inadequacy of simpler terms. Words mattered now in a way they hadn't before. For one member of Maggie's family, that evolution offered a small comfort. It suggested that the system had learned something, that their loss had contributed to a more honest reckoning with uncertainty. It didn't make the past right, but it made the future slightly more bearable. Sometimes, that is all meaning amounts to. As the years stretched on, the cold case faded further into the background. No longer the subject of active conversation, but never entirely gone. It existed in layers, in the way cities hold their histories, compressed beneath newer stories, accessible only if you know where to look. The 10th phase did not resolve the tension at the heart of Maggie Calloway's story. Instead, it normalized it. Uncertainty became part of the landscape, something people learned to live around rather than eliminate. The idea that a case could be both solved and unresolved stopped feeling contradictory and started feeling honest. Chicago moved forward, as it always does, carrying Maggie's story with it, not as a headline, but as a quiet influence, shaping how justice is imagined and discussed. The cold case remained closed in status, unchanged, but its legacy continued to unfold, less dramatic now, more subtle, woven into the city's understanding of loss, time, and the limits of what answers can provide. And somewhere within that understanding was an acceptance that some stories do not end with clarity or catharsis. They end with endurance, with the decision to remember without resolution, to acknowledge what was lost without insisting it be fully explained. Maggie Calloway's story had reached that place, suspended between past and present, waiting not for answers, but for the final, inevitable passage of time. The 11th and final movement does not announce itself as an ending, because this story never learned how to end cleanly. It arrives instead as a quiet convergence, the place where all the years, all the revisions, all the unanswered questions settle into something heavier than resolution, and more enduring than doubt. By now, Maggie Calloway's case no longer belongs to investigators or headlines. It belongs to time itself, and to the people who have carried it, knowingly or not, through their lives. Chicago barely notices the anniversary when it passes. The city is louder now, faster, layered with new emergencies and new names. Sirens cut through nights that feel nothing like 1985. And yet, in the rhythm of footsteps on cold pavement, in the way people glance over their shoulders without knowing why, the past still murmurs. Not as a warning, not as a lesson, just as presence. The file remains where it has been for years, intact, orderly, sealed with language that feels definitive on the surface and fragile underneath. Killer identified. Case closed. Modern forensics. Each word chosen carefully, each one doing work it was never designed to do. The truth inside those pages is precise, technical, and incomplete, and everyone closest to it understands that this is as far as the system can go. There is no final revelation waiting offstage. No confession tape mislabeled in an evidence room. No witness stepping forward at the last possible moment. The story resists that fantasy. It insists on something more uncomfortable, the idea that knowing who is not the same as knowing why, and that justice, once delayed long enough, changes its shape entirely. For Maggie's family, the passage of time has transformed grief into something quieter, but no less real. They speak her name easily now, without the sharp intake of breath that once followed it. They remember her laugh, her stubbornness, her plans. The case is no longer the center of her memory. It is something that happened to her, not something that defines her. That distinction matters. They have learned to live with the asymmetry of it all. The fact that the man responsible was named but never judged, identified but never confronted. There is no satisfaction in that outcome, only acceptance. Acceptance is not forgiveness. It is not peace. It is simply the recognition that some balances will never be restored. Within the department, Maggie Calloway's case is referenced less often now, but when it is, it carries a certain gravity. It reminds detectives that certainty is fragile, that conclusions age, that today's answers may be tomorrow's footnotes. It has shaped how cold cases are spoken about, how promises are made, how expectations are set. In that way, it has altered futures it will never see. The city carries the story the way cities carry all their stories, unevenly, imperfectly. Most people will never know Maggie's name. Some will recognize it faintly, a half-memory triggered by a headline long ago. A few will always remember exactly where they were when they first heard it. This is how history disperses itself, not evenly, but in pockets of remembrance and forgetting. On certain winter nights, when the air feels especially sharp and the streets briefly empty, the past feels closer. A woman walks alone, coat pulled tight, footsteps echoing. A bus passes. A door closes. Nothing happens. And yet the absence of something happening is felt. A subtle tension inherited from stories like Maggie's, from nights that ended differently. The cold case is closed. The words are final. They will not be changed. But finality, it turns out, is not the same as silence. The case still speaks, not in evidence or announcements, but in the way it lingers, in the way it shaped conversations about justice, about memory, about what it means to arrive too late with the right answer. Maggie Calloway did not become a warning by choice. She did not consent to being a symbol, or a benchmark, or a case study. She was a person who walked through a city one night, and did not come home. Everything that followed is an attempt to make sense of that fact, to impose structure on something that resists it. In the end, there is no twist left to reveal. Only a quiet truth that remains when all others fall away. A life was taken. A name was found. Time passed. And what remains is not closure, but memory, persistent and unresolved, living on in the spaces between what we can prove and what we must carry. Chicago continues as it always has. The streets change. The lights change. The people change. But somewhere beneath it all, a winter night in 1985 still exists, untouched by explanation, sealed but not erased. The cold case is closed. The story is not. There was never meant to be a 12th passage, and maybe that is why it feels different, less like continuation and more like an echo, the sound that lingers after the last word has already been spoken. This is what happens when a story refuses to stay contained, when it slips past its own ending and continues to exist in the margins, in the quiet, in the lives that were shaped by it without ever asking permission. Long after the case stopped being discussed, long after Maggie Calloway's name faded from training slides and policy memos, the city kept absorbing the consequences in small, almost invisible ways. A woman chose a different route home. A detective hesitated before closing a file. A supervisor rewrote a sentence, softened a claim, added a footnote where certainty once stood alone. None of them traced those choices back to Maggie, but they were connected all the same. This is how unresolved stories work. They don't demand attention. They influence behavior. They settle into instinct. Maggie's case had become part of the city's muscle memory, shaping how danger was perceived and how promises were made. It existed not as a headline, but as a pressure, subtle and constant. Somewhere in a storage facility, climate-controlled and quiet, her evidence still rests. Labels intact. Boxes aligned. A physical reminder that truth can be preserved even when meaning cannot. No one expects those boxes to be opened again. They are not waiting for discovery. They are waiting for acknowledgement, for the understanding that preservation itself is an act of respect, even when nothing more will come of it. The suspect's name, now rarely spoken, has lost its gravity. It no longer anchors the story. If anything, it feels incidental, a technical endpoint rather than a narrative one. What mattered more, in the end, was the absence he left behind, the gap between a life interrupted and a system that arrived too late to fully respond. Maggie's family continues forward, as families always do, carrying her with them in ways no case file could ever record. She exists in jokes repeated, recipes remembered, opinions inherited. She is present at gatherings where her absence is no longer announced, only felt. That is not closure. It is continuity. Every so often, a new cold case surfaces in the news. Another name, another year, another promise of answers through modern forensics. And for those who remember Maggie's story, there is a flicker of recognition, a quiet hope tempered by experience. They know now that identification is not the same as resolution, that answers can arrive stripped of consequence, that time changes what justice looks like. The city has learned to live with that knowledge. Not comfortably but honestly. Chicago has always carried its history in layers, violence and resilience stacked together, each generation inheriting both. Maggie Calloway's case occupies one of those layers, neither erased nor dominant, simply present. If this story has a final truth, it is not about who killed Maggie or how the case was closed. It is about what lingers when the official work is done, what remains when certainty runs out, what a community carries forward when it has no choice but to move on. The 12th passage does not add facts. It does not reopen questions. It simply acknowledges what has been true all along. That a cold case can be closed and still cast a shadow. That a name can be found and still leave silence behind. That some nights never fully pass, no matter how many years come after them. Chicago knows this now. And so does anyone who listens closely enough, long after the story was supposed to be over. The 13th passage doesn't feel like continuation so much as residue. The fine dust left after everything solid has already settled. By now, the story of Maggie Calloway exists almost entirely in implication, in the way it bends thought rather than drives action, in how it resurfaces not as a narrative but as a sensation, a brief tightening in the chest when certain words are spoken together. Chicago, 1985 cold case. There is a point where even memory changes texture. Facts remain fixed, but emotion thins, spreads out, loses its sharp edges. Maggie's case has reached that point. It no longer demands to be understood. It asks only to be held lightly, without expectation. The city has learned this posture over time, how to carry unresolved things without constantly reopening them. New investigators come and go, many of them never reading Maggie's file in full. They know of it abstractly, a reference, a precedent. Some have heard the title, that jarring contradiction, cold case closed. They understand the words individually. It takes longer to understand them together. That understanding arrives slowly, usually after their first unsatisfying ending, their first case that resolves on paper but not in the gut. In those moments, Maggie Calloway's story finds them again, not as instruction, but as recognition. A quiet reassurance that discomfort does not mean failure, that ambiguity is sometimes the most honest outcome available. This is not written anywhere. It is absorbed, passed along in tone and caution, in pauses before declarations. Outside the system, the world continues its relentless production of new stories, new crimes, new victims, new urgencies. Maggie's name almost never appears now. When it does, it feels archaeological, like brushing dirt from something carefully, aware that too much pressure could damage what remains. Her story has crossed the threshold from current to historical, a shift that feels both inevitable and cruel. Yet history is not inert. It presses back in subtle ways. A journalist hesitates before using the word solved. A podcast producer leaves a question unanswered instead of forcing a conclusion. A viewer listens differently, less hungry for resolution, more attuned to absence. These are small effects, nearly invisible, but they accumulate. Maggie's case has altered the shape of attention. The street where she died continues to change. Paint peels and is repainted. Businesses fail and are replaced. People fall in love there, argue there, wait for rides there. None of them know they are standing in a place that once absorbed a life. That anonymity feels wrong and right at the same time. Memory does not require constant witnesses to remain real. For Maggie's family, time has rearranged the hierarchy of pain. The case is no longer the sharpest edge. Birthdays missed, conversations imagined, futures never reached, those have taken its place. The investigation, the announcement, the debates, all of that now feels distant, almost procedural compared to the ongoing reality of absence. Maggie is not a case to them. She is a presence shaped by love, not by violence. The man identified as her killer has receded into irrelevance, so complete it feels intentional. His name no longer anchors discussion. His life has no arc, no meaning beyond the harm he caused. That perhaps is the most complete justice available now, not punishment but obscurity. The refusal to let him define the story any longer. What remains is a space where certainty once tried to stand. A space where questions once demanded answers. That space is quieter now. Not empty, just quieter. It holds the understanding that some truths arrive without resolution. And some endings are administrative rather than human. The 13th passage is not an addition to the story. It is what happens after repetition wears itself thin, after analysis exhausts itself, after the need to explain gives way to the need to accept. It is the phase where the story stops moving forward and starts sinking deeper, embedding itself into the long-term memory of a place. Chicago carries many such stories. Maggie's is one of them. Not the loudest, not the bloodiest, but persistent. Defined not by what was revealed, but by what could never be fully retrieved. It exists now as a quiet influence, shaping how people think about time, about justice, about the difference between naming a truth and understanding it. There will be no further parts that add substance, only echoes that fade at different speeds, depending on who is listening. Maggie Calloway's cold case has finished unfolding. What continues is not the story itself, but its shadow, stretching forward, thinning, never quite disappearing, reminding the city in its own muted way that some answers arrive late, some arrive incomplete, and some arrive only to show us the limits of what answers can ever be. The 14th passage feels almost weightless, as if the story has thinned to breath and atmosphere, to what remains after meaning has been worn smooth by time. By now, Maggie Calloway's case is less a narrative than a condition, a quiet awareness that settles into the bones of a city and stays there, influencing how people move through the dark without ever announcing why. Chicago has learned to live with this kind of residue. It exists in the way the city pauses after certain headlines, in the way officials choose their words more carefully, in the way promises are framed with caution rather than certainty. Maggie's story did not end in triumph or failure. It ended in restraint. And restraint in a city shaped by extremes is its own kind of legacy. Some nights, the archives are quiet enough that you can hear the building itself, the low hum of climate control, the faint creak of shelves bearing decades of unresolved lives. Maggie's file rests among them, unchanged, not because it lacks importance, but because it has given everything it can. The paper no longer asks to be read. It asks to be remembered accurately, without embellishment, without erasure. The phrase cold case closed has aged in the public ear. It no longer sounds like victory. It sounds like an agreement, a mutual acknowledgement between institutions and communities that this is where the line must be drawn, not because the truth is complete, but because it is complete enough to stop pretending otherwise. That shift in understanding is subtle, but it matters. In classrooms and lecture halls, instructors reference cases like Maggie's when discussing the ethics of certainty. They ask students to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to force endings where none exist. Some students push back, uncomfortable with ambiguity. Others recognize something real in it, an honesty they rarely encounter in official narratives. Maggie's story becomes a quiet test of maturity, not of knowledge. The city's newer generations inherit the consequences without the context. They walk streets layered with unseen history, carrying instincts shaped by stories they've never heard. They choose well-lit paths. They text when they arrive home. They hesitate at intersections late at night. None of them know Maggie's name, but they live in the behavioral afterimage of her story. For those who do remember, the case has entered a different emotional register. It no longer provokes anger or urgency. It provokes reflection. It sits beside other questions that don't resolve cleanly, questions about timing, about fairness, about the limits of systems designed by humans to account for human harm. Maggie's family continues forward, carrying her in ways that grow quieter, but no less real. Her absence has become a constant rather than a wound, a fixed point around which life has reorganized itself. The case, once so dominant, now feels like an outer ring of that absence, important but no longer central. The man identified as her killer has vanished almost completely from collective memory. His name, once printed and debated, now feels unnecessary. The story no longer needs him. What remains is the impact of his action, diffused across time, touching people who will never know why they flinch at certain thoughts, why certain endings feel insufficient. This is where the story finally settles, not into silence, but into integration. Maggie Calloway's death is no longer an interruption to the city's narrative. It is part of it, folded in, absorbed, not solved in the way stories promise, but understood in the way life often requires. There will be no new revelations waiting beyond this point. No hidden chapters. Only the steady passage of time, carrying the story further from its origin while never fully severing the connection. The case will continue to exist as long as the city does, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. The 14th passage does not close anything. It acknowledges what has already happened. That the story has moved beyond investigation, beyond debate, beyond even memory as an active force. It has become atmosphere. And atmosphere, once formed, does not disappear. It surrounds. It influences. It remains. The cold case is closed. The city continues. And somewhere between those two facts, the truth lives on, quiet, unresolved, and permanent. The 15th passage arrives like the last light in a long winter day, not gone, not present, just thinning into something that can no longer be pointed at. By now, the story of Maggie Calloway has traveled so far from its origin that it no longer resembles an event. It resembles a trace, the kind left behind by something that mattered deeply and then passed through, altering the space forever. Chicago carries countless traces like this. They overlap, blur, cancel each other out. Most are forgotten. Maggie's wasn't, not entirely. It stayed because it never resolved into something clean. It stayed because it asked too much of certainty and received too little in return. In a city accustomed to loud endings, that quiet imbalance stood out. No one actively tells the story anymore. It surfaces sideways in phrasing, in caution, in the way certain conclusions are hedged instead of declared. Someone says as far as we know. Someone else says based on the evidence available. Those qualifiers did not used to be there. They exist now because of cases like Maggie's, because of the discomfort left behind when words outran truth. The place where she died has fully blended back into the city. There is nothing to distinguish it. No marker. No plaque. Just concrete in motion, and people passing through without pause. And yet, if you stand there long enough, there is a strange neutrality to the space, as if it has learned not to react, not to ask to be noticed again. History doesn't always mark itself. Sometimes it dissolves on the surface and stays underneath. Maggie herself has receded into something gentler than memory. She is no longer imagined in her final moments. She is imagined in fragments of life, walking quickly to stay warm, laughing at something unimportant, planning something ordinary. The violence no longer dominates her image. Time has finally done that small mercy. The case file still exists, but it no longer defines the story. It is an artifact now, a record of effort rather than outcome. It documents how hard people tried, how long they waited, how technology eventually spoke when humans could not. It also documents restraint, the point where the system stopped pretending it could offer more than it had. Cold case. Closed. Identified. The words remain correct. They are no longer sufficient. They function now as coordinates, not conclusions, pointing back to a place where certainty ended and something quieter began. The man responsible has faded completely from relevance. There is no curiosity left about him, no urge to understand his interior life. That curiosity belonged to earlier phases, when answers still felt possible. Now he exists only as the absence of accountability, a blank space where consequence should have been. Even that absence has softened with time. What remains strongest is the imprint left on everyone who passed through the story at some point. The detectives who learned caution. The family who learned endurance. The city that learned restraint. None of them would have chosen this education. All of them carry it anyway. The 15th passage is not reflective in the way earlier ones were. It is quieter than reflection. It is normalization. This is what it looks like when a story has finished changing the people it was going to change. When it no longer demands attention, but still shapes the environment. There will be a day when Maggie Calloway's name is no longer recognized at all. That is not erasure. It is the final stage of absorption. Her story will live on only in what it altered, in the systems that hesitate, in the language that softens, in the instincts that linger without origin. That is how cold cases truly end. Not with answers. Not with justice. But with influence so diffuse it can no longer be traced back to a single night, a single file, a single life. The story does not move forward from here. It settles. And in that settling, The city continues to carry what cannot be resolved, not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully, one quiet step at a time, long after the words "case closed" have stopped sounding like an ending at all.